my observation and some level of experience, you got to have parents willing to admit there's a serious issue, and not be embarrassed, not be afraid to go seek help quickly. You got to have those things working all kind of in conjunction with you. It's fine. It's fine. I'm not going to say anything wrong. But yeah.
What was that, Chris?
Yeah. But you got to have that buying attitude early on. So.
And you have to keep working at the systemic causes that create
ain't no
the
doubt
need that these kids have to join gangs.
No doubt about it.
No
doubt.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm Steve Goman. I'm the director of the John H. Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise, and I want to thank you for attending our final event for the Schnatter Center for this semester. Our other programs this spring have dealt with criminal justice at the national level, and today we're going to look at the local level. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. A few details first. Fall registrations this week, I do believe. Is that right? And you guys should be picking up your economics classes right off the bat. Remember, starting the fall, the math requirement for econ majors will be either Math 180 or Math 205. And also you can get a BS with the business core or a BA with arts and sciences core. So you do have options. I just had lunch yesterday with one of our graduates. He's working down at Humana, and he's doing really well. He's going to go to graduate school, I think. But he was talking about how much his economics helped him get his job. So it's good for getting jobs. I'd like to invite you students who will be here next semester to consider joining one of our reading groups. Some of the reading group students are here. It's pretty interesting. We read a couple books, meet 1 or 2 nights or 3 nights, have nice meals, and talk about the books we've read. And we're going to bring in Tyler Cowan in. He's an author of several books, and each reading group's going to read one of his books. You'll get to meet him, probably go out to dinner or to lunch with him. And so watch for the email invitations next semester, or go to our website and sign up. Be happy to have you in our reading groups. If you're part of the Card Success Series, you be sure to sign in the registration sheets at the tables outside the auditorium when you leave. If you're here for extra credit, make sure you pick up your extra credit card when you leave. These will be handed out at the end of the program, along with free pizza as usual. All right, finally, the Departments of Philosophy, Political Science, and Economics offering a PPE minor. That's Philosophy, Politics, and Economics minor. The first course of the 2 required PPE courses will be offered this fall. It's PPE 300. It's offered on Monday and Wednesday, 2 to 3:15. You should consider that if you're interested in any of those topical areas. Okay, so let's get on to the panel. So Kentucky has one of the largest prison populations in the world. We incarcerate 900 people per 100,000. So that's almost 1% of our population's in prison. Louisville has had really a lot of violent crime recently. Its murder rate was 11th highest in the U.S. the year before last. And it seems like every day we're hearing about another murder. And this violence is really a sad situation for our city. And so to help to understand this violent crime rate in our city and how to deal with it more effectively, we've got 3 experts on the Louisville criminal justice system here. First, we have Christopher 2X. He's a community leader, anti-violence advocate, and an active voice for the voiceless. Chris has been on the front lines of the city's violent crime scene for almost 15 years. He was instrumental in calming the storm of rioting after an officer was acquitted of shooting 19-year-old Michael Newby in 2004. He's created and co-created campaigns such as Fight Crimes Against Children, Connected Voices, Voices of Survivors, Put Down the Guns, Justice for Little Ones, see his shirt there, among others. His Hood to Hood movement aims to bring neighborhoods together through organized activities, settling differences through communication, creating positive images, and spirit building. His #1 goal is to bring a healing and compassionate presence to the varying chaotic situations that arise whenever needed. Our second panelist is Josh Crawford from the Pegasus Institute. Josh received his bachelor's degree in crime, law, and justice from Penn State University. After graduation, he attended Suffolk University Law School in Boston, and he received his Juris Doctorate. While in law school, he worked for Massachusetts Bar Association and was a fellow at the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation. His work appeared before the United States Supreme Court from that group. He's also served as Rule 303 student prosecutor for Plymouth County. He served at the District Attorney's Office and a law clerk for Boston Municipal Court of Justice. For Justice Michael Coyne, excuse me. Before joining Pegasus Institute, he was prosecutor with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office in California. His primary areas of research are urban violence and criminal justice reform. And then our final panelist is Dr. Deborah Keel. Professor Keel is currently Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs at the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice. She serves on a number of university and professional boards, including the Board of Directors of Kentucky Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory, She's a member of the National Advisory Board for the FBI Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory Program, the University of Louisville Police Advisory Board, and a member of the Advisory Board of the Turkish Institute for the Security of Democracy. She has extensive experience in applied research within criminal justice agencies, conducted research and consultation for various federal, state, and local organizations, including the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics, New York State Police, Kentucky Department of Corrections, Kentucky Justice Cabinet, Metro Criminal Justice Commission, and Louisville Metro Police Department. More recently, she served as interim executive director of the Louisville Metro Criminal Justice Commission. So we're going to hear from each one of them. They're going to give maybe about an 8 to 10 minute talk. And then I might ask a few questions. And then we will have questions from the audience here, mostly from students, I hope initially, but anybody else if no students want to ask questions. So we're going to start with Chris and then just going down the line. So Chris, please.
Well, thanks, and thanks for all of you all for being here, and I really appreciate the invite. I'd like to kind of set the tone from what Steve was talking about the redundancy of unfortunate violent crime and violent shootings in the metro. So in December of 2017, December the 11th to be exact, there was a 3-month plus effort with about 64 or so individuals. Those who had been impacted by violence, which we describe as survivors, whether they lost a loved one to non-fatal shootings or fatal shootings, a combination of individuals who were connected to the Louisville Metro Police Department, and also University of Louisville Trauma Outreach surgeons and nurses who have been a part of these unfortunate experiences as far as treatment at the hospital. And together with the Pegasus Institute, we came up with a report titled the Pegasus Institute Voices of the Survivors Louisville Metro Violent Crime Impact Report. And Josh, hopefully when you open up, you can tell them where to go get this at if they want to get it online to kind of study this themselves. But anyway, the goal was simple. It was to tell it was to give at least a chance for survivors to give a longer storyline connected to when the founding of Metro government started, which is January of 2003, into that November of 2017. And it was to give them a voice where they could at least express themselves in a way to try to at least let the public know how serious and how, let me say this, how profound this problem really is. And with that said, you had to get to the data and the numbers. During that 15-year time frame, from January of 2003 into December of 2017, we have lost 1,000 plus individuals to criminal homicides in the metro. 1,000 plus. Those who have been shot and wounded and survived in the metro from that 15-year time frame was 3,000 plus individuals that had been shot and wounded in Metro Louisville. And throughout 15 years and some change now, I have met both sides of that issue, dealing with survivors who have lost somebody fatally to shootings, and also those who have been non-fatal shootings, who are the survivors who go to University of Louisville Hospital, where our trauma center is. They get treated, and they have a combination of, aftermath deals that they have to deal with. Some are paraplegics, some walk out of the hospital and get shot again, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. Some are individuals who get hit by stray bullets, have nothing to do with neighborhood so-called beef issues, and get caught in harm's way by stray gunfire. But the bottom line is, with this report, and what's so important about this report, it kind of gives a voice to those who have been impacted the most in this city, and how they not only just tell a story about being impacted by a loss or somebody getting hurt, but they tell the story about how they deal with kind of dual things within that family setting, where somebody is so hurt behind somebody getting wounded or either killed in their family Now you got another one who doesn't want to let law enforcement do their job, and they want to partake in retaliatory shootings behind that. And so the parents got to get caught up in a dual situation where they're grieving for this loved one. And at the same time, now they're trying to play this interventionist who's saying, I just don't want you to go out and take the law in your own hands and shoot and wound or kill somebody else. Where they're going to be dealing with the criminal justice system or either more retaliatory shoots. So quickly, with the little time I've got left, I wanted to first say that there are a lot of good faith efforts trying to at least come up with strategies to try to downtick these numbers. In 2015, we had close to at least 90 criminal homicides. In 2016, we had our all-time record of criminal homicides in Metro Louisville, and also people being non-fatal individuals as it relates to gunshot wounds. In 2016, there was 117 criminal homicides. It broke all records in the history of the city of Louisville and the newfound Metro government, which started in 2003. 500 individuals in 2016 in Metro Louisville were wounded by gunfire and survived. Coming to 2017, it didn't get that much better. 107 criminal homicides and 400 individuals wounded by gunfire. We have several individuals from the University of Louisville who were students that have been caught up in this 15-year vicious cycle. I remember Trent Guy went to his hospital bed several years ago. He was a wide receiver from the University of Louisville Cardinals football team. He got shot having a nice time in downtown Louisville in Theater Square on 4th and Broadway across from the Brown Hotel at a club which is closed now called Club Villa Fontana. And then we talk about Savannah Walker last year at the Tim Faulkner Art Gallery, a student here at the University of Louisville, being hit by stray gunfire where several people got wounded and she was her life was fatally taken away. So the bottom line is these numbers are serious and they're real. It is a public health crisis. But before I close out, I want to identify you all with the first page of this report where we talk about a 7-year-old little boy who was looking forward to his 2nd grade promotion, and he didn't make it. And we created a campaign in his mom's honor and her effort to raise awareness of having a voice for her child, and it speaks about it on the front page introduction of this report. And his name was DeQuante Hobbs Jr. This May 21st will mark the 1st-year anniversary of when this child was sitting at his kitchen table in West Louisville, having a wonderful time throughout the weekend and looking forward to being promoted at his elementary school, it was Sarah B. Wellington Elementary School out on Cane Run Road. He was looking forward to a Tuesday, the 23rd of May, promotion into the 2nd grade. In 2017, they had cookout that weekend. And on that Sunday before he was going to retire to bed, he asked his mom, could he get another piece of the leftover celebration cake? And could he play some multiplication tables on his tablet? And so he sat at that kitchen table, and there was something that occurred outside the house where boys got into some kind of argument, and about several volley of gunshots went off, some say 10 to 12 gunshots. One of the bullets flew through the window, hit the child in the neck area of the head. He was rushed to Norton's Children's Hospital, and then a little bit after midnight on the 22nd of May of 2017, he was pronounced dead. It was an outrageous crime against the child, and unfortunately, it was a wake-up call for many that everybody is not safe from reckless gunplay. And I'll kind of wrap it up on this note. DeQuante's story is an ongoing story. It's being told in many ways. And we just finished filming a piece on him. NBC Universal called us about over a month and a half ago. And they were so taken by this this young child's death that they wanted to create a story on a national level about DeQuante's story of a kid who looked so much forward to promise by being, just a student and his love for the University of Louisville basketball team, which I really want to give a shout out to the basketball team. When this occurred last May and June of last year, they created a life-size, authentic jersey that was given to the family from the athletic department. And this kid's favorite number put on the jersey, number 7, and he died at age 7. And it had his name on the back of the jersey. And it was something that his mother could at least cherish for the rest of her life as she has to deal with this enduring pain. And I wanted to mention DeQuante's story because, again, I think all of us in this room, regardless of where you live at in Metro Louisville or where you go to have a nice time at in Metro Louisville, we can relate to a child being hit by a stray bullet and try to at least understand how serious this problem really is. So I would like for you all to at least, if you could do anything when you leave here at some point, once Josh gives you all the information on where to go get this on the website, please consider doing that. I think when you read this report, you can get a better idea from the voices of the survivors who are connected to these impactful situations and try to get an understanding that this doesn't just touch one demographic of Metro Louisville. In this report, and I helped put these survivors together with Josh, they touch all parts of this community. Because I work with white families, immigrant families, Hispanic families, black families, and every family in this metro in 15 years have been touched by senseless gun violence. And I just thank you all for your time being here, and I look forward to getting questions that I might chime in on from Steve. But I just wanted to give you all a quick understanding on how the survivors have been impacted by this issue. Steve?
Great.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate the way that you introduced us to this topic, because I'll talk for a bit about numbers, but behind every one of those numbers is an individual, a life that was cut short, a life that was fundamentally changed through violence, through gunfire. And so I think first what I'll do is talk a bit about where the city is historically, where we are sort of right now. 2015, we had 80 homicides in what is LMPD's jurisdiction of Louisville. That was the largest number of homicides that we have had since 1979. As Chris said, in 2016, we had 117 homicides. Last year, 107 homicides. 16 and 17 were the first 2 years that we had north of 100 homicides 2 years in a row since 1970 and 1971. 2016 being the all-time record with 117. Violent crime, in particular homicide, is up in 2/3 of major American cities since 2015. But what is relatively unique about Louisville is, despite violent crime and homicides being up in most cities, it's still near historic lows. Most cities have seen declining homicide and violent crime rates for the last 20+ years. Louisville has experienced this uptick, but it's been such a dramatic uptick that it has produced the most violent year in our city's history. And so, anytime you're talking about violent crime, homicide, and non-fatal shootings in particular, you're presented with two equally important problems. First, how do you reduce it? How do you mitigate it? How do you try to end the violence? And the second problem is, how do you deal with the destruction that it leaves behind? New York City in 1990 had just under 2,500 murders. Last year, New York City had just over 290 murders. So New York City has about 10% of the murders it did in 1990. So it's possible to reduce your violence in a meaningful way, but even if you do, even if Louisville had 10% of the murders next year that it did last year, you're still talking about 10 individuals, 10 families, 10 friend groups whose lives are forever changed by violence. And so when we look at violence, and we look first and foremost at how to prevent and how to reduce violence, from my perspective, the best teacher is experience. And so we look at other cities and how other cities were able to successfully reduce their violent crime. From my perspective, Cincinnati is probably the city that has done this the best anywhere in the United States. Violence peaked in Cincinnati in 2006. City officials, law enforcement, community organizations, church groups, nonprofits came together and said, that's not what we want in this city. This is not the city that we want to be. And so they put together a strategy called SERVE. It involved a focused deterrence policing strategy. That's a policing strategy that focuses resources on violent and high-risk offenders, violent and high-risk groups, gangs. They utilized Ohio's gang enhancement law to go after the top gang members, to arrest, apprehend, and punish those who would prey on the most vulnerable members of our communities, and then utilized wraparound services through those church groups, community institutions, and government entities to try to divert juveniles away from a life of gangs. And so in the evaluation period thereafter, the city of Cincinnati saw a 41% reduction in gang and street group related homicides. And so we know what works. We know what has worked other places. Focused deterrence strategies, for example, have been tried and successful in over 40 cities. When you talk about violence and you talk about criminal justice, your policing strategy is the single most important part of your strategy. I say that not because occupation-style policing is desirable or flooding the streets with cops is what you need to do, but the police are where the overwhelming majority of citizens will interact with the criminal justice system. From those who get a speeding ticket to those who will never see an arrest in a loved one's murder, but it's still an officer who tells them that their loved one has died. And so your policing strategy is of the utmost importance, and your police are the most visceral and direct example of government in neighborhoods. And so the relationship between your most affected neighborhoods and the police is tantamount to a successful policing strategy. One of the most concerning things for me in 2015 and 16 in the city of Louisville is our self-initiated police activity dropped off a cliff. And so officers were less engaged in the community, were dealing less with problems as they emerged and more with problems after they occurred. And that becomes a problem. And when your legitimate use of force, when your legitimate representation of force is removed from a neighborhood in a meaningful way, then an illegitimate force will almost always enter. Vacuums don't stay vacuums for long. And what has happened is that gangs have been able to, in certain neighborhoods, fill that void. And so I think the city has done a very good job in recent months and years to address this, recent months I should say, to address this problem, to recognize this problem, and to go after this problem. And I'm hopeful that if we can replicate what was done in Cincinnati, that we can replicate the results of Cincinnati. The second part of this is what Chris has already spoke to some extent, and that is the people that violence leaves in its wake. The average homicide leaves behind 7 to 10 close family members, in addition to coworkers, friends, neighbors. Those are people who are left to grieve. And in many ways, they're the people who are left to deal with the system that non-fatal crime victims deal with themselves. It is family members of homicide victims who have to deal with police and prosecutors, courts, parole hearings, all types of things like that. And so when we look at what survivors need, we put forth 3 recommendations. The first is to elevate the status of victims and survivors into the criminal justice system so that it is a co-equal position with defendants. You do that via a constitutional amendment that guarantees that crime victims have the right to be heard, to be present, to be informed. It gives no substantive right to control proceedings, but it does give those rights. The second way that you do that is by putting victim services at the place where citizens interact with their government most viscerally, and that is your police department. By doing police-based victim services, it's not only individuals who find themselves in the court process who get access to resources. We have a wonderful victim service-based system in our Commonwealth and county attorney's offices, but our homicide clearance rate is only about 50%. And so that means 50% of families who lose a loved one will never get any sort of introduction to those services because those services exist after arrest and during prosecution. And so by moving those services into the police department, you give those services to a much wider array of people. The final recommendation is that Louisville establish a nonprofit dedicated to filling the gaps financially for survivors. One of the things that became very apparent during the interview process for the Voices of the Survivors was that some have no financial needs, some have great financial needs, but those that do have financial needs, they vary dramatically from individual to individual. For some, it is the probate costs. If they had an adult child who was murdered who had property and things to probate, there are costs associated with that process. For others, it is a desire to move out of a neighborhood where an offender also lives and hasn't been apprehended. They have money for their rent, but they need a first and last month's deposit, and so they need some sort of financing like that. And so rather than ask Metro Council specifically for those kinds of resources, we thought a nonprofit would be better suited to be more flexible to the individual needs of individual survivors. And so it is my hope that as these conversations continue, both here today in Metro Council in Frankfort, that we can get to a point where we not only combat the violence, we not only reduce the violence, but we also deal with the repercussions of the violence.
Correct. Thank you, Josh. Deborah?
Next. All right, so I obviously didn't understand the format of this, so I wrote a presentation thinking I was going to be at a table and you wouldn't be able to see that I was having to use a cheat sheet. So you will just have to bear with me on that. I am coming from a little different perspective. What I want to talk about, my specialty is criminal justice policy and program, policy analysis and program evaluation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the complexities involved in developing criminal justice policies, because it is a very challenging area. And there were a couple of researchers in the I think 1973 is when they published the article, well before most of you were born out there. And they were urban planners and urban policy developers. And they wrote this article making the argument that social problems are what they call wicked problems. You know, they're ill-defined. I mean, how do we define what constitutes racially biased policing? You know, what percentage overrepresentation of African Americans among the drivers stopped constitutes specific bias on the part of police officers? You know, what percentage do we have to have in terms of disproportionate minority confinement for us to define that as a problem? So the solutions become very challenging because we have difficulty defining the problem. Gun control is probably a great issue. You know, if you talk to people about their positions on gun control, it gets very political and it gets very sort of value-laden. And most of the issues that we deal with as criminal justice policymakers and program developers fall into this category of these wicked problems. So one of the issues that we need to think about when we start developing policies in criminal justice related to homicides, related to gangs, related to general violent behavior, property crime, really anything, is that we need to deal with simultaneously interdiction and prevention. All right? If we only deal with interdiction, if we only suppress the gangs and we don't deal with the causes, we don't deal with the reasons why young people are motivated to join the gangs, which is a preventative measure, then we're really not developing a program or an approach to crime that's going to solve the problem, because you can suppress and suppress and suppress, but if you don't prevent, there's always somebody new coming up to take the place of the folks that you have suppressed. Yep. Crime has very complex causes. We can't underestimate the complexities. Some of these causes are systemic causes. They're deeply rooted in our society, and they have to do with marginalization of different groups and individuals. They have to do with differential access to educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and so we need to recognize that. So a lot of times we can't get at those issues, and so what we do is we deal with the symptoms, right? We can't solve the social problems that create gangs, but we can, in fact, try to suppress gang behavior. So we have to understand that when we develop policies, we're really not getting at the ultimate causes. So we may have to keep, that's why we have to keep reinventing the wheel in criminal justice, frankly, because something will work for a while, and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore, so we have to come up with something new because we've never addressed those real causes. The other thing about criminal justice policy and crime in general is that, and my two colleagues have both mentioned this directly or alluded to it, is that it's not the responsibility of one organization or one entity or one groups of individuals in a community or in a society. So we can't lay the responsibility for the crime problem solely on the police, all right? They are the gateway. They are the individuals who perform the most immediate actions to suppress crime or to prevent crime within a community, but they are not solely responsible for it. I mean, crime is the result of many complex factors, and so the solution needs to involve a wide range of stakeholders, a wide range of groups and individuals, and we can't continue to blame the police for the problem, because when police, you know, all this stuff about CSI and the cops running in and, you know, collecting the evidence and running into the equipment in the lab and, you know, going out and arresting the person, that's all a bunch of BS. I mean, so police solve crimes primarily because they get information from victims and witnesses. And I know that there are reasons why victims and witnesses don't want to get involved, and a lot of times they're very legitimate. But the police rely on citizens to help them solve crimes. So if the community is not partnering with the police in trying to come up with a solution to the crime problem, it's never going to work. The next issue is that we need to think a little bit about this concept of widening the net. I'm a criminal justice professor. Anybody who takes a criminal justice class learns about widening the net. Widening the net means that you essentially create a policy or create a program with a defined target population, but you inadvertently sweep other individuals into it. And this is one of the, I mean, I don't really have a position because I haven't read enough of it, but this is one of the issues that some individuals have with this new gang legislation, is that instead of really targeting just the very serious gang-involved individuals, they may inadvertently get young people, pull young people into the juvenile justice system. And so we have to look out for it. I mean, another example that I would give you is sometimes if you develop a police diversion program, all right, so the police, in lieu of taking someone to jail, are going to take them to a halfway house or a mental health center or whatever. Sometimes what will happen is that the police will end up taking individuals who they otherwise would have left alone to the mental health center, all right, which is widening the net. We're involving a person in the system who wouldn't otherwise have been involved. Another complexity in terms of criminal justice policy is that there can be latent and unintended consequences to policies that we develop. So we really have to think about all of the different, you need to think about a policy as having an impact, but then having tendrils that can grow and seek out untargeted populations. Probably the best example of latent consequences with criminal justice policy that I think most of you will be familiar with is the concept of parens patriae for juveniles in the juvenile justice system. You know, we introduced this concept that in the juvenile justice system, the judge is supposed to act like the father, or now we would say the mother. When it came about, it was women weren't involved. But anyway, so parens patriae, the judge acts as a parental figure. We don't need juveniles, because they're being taken care of by the judge, don't really need due process. They don't need to have access to a trial by jury. Well, this resulted in a number of juveniles getting much more severe sentences than they would have otherwise, because they didn't have due process. So we've now had to change that policy. I think another just part of all this policy development to keep in mind is that we're dealing with a system, all right? So the criminal justice system has 3 parts. Here's your intro to criminal justice lecture if you haven't taken that class. The police, the courts, and corrections. When you change the operations or the behaviors of one part of that system, it affects the other parts. Now, because the police are on the intake end, they are usually the component that most dramatically affects the other 2 parts. So something to think about is if we engage in, for example, targeted policing, suppression of gangs, suppression of repeat offenders, what happens? More people get arrested, right? More people go to jail, right? Jail becomes overcrowded, which is bad for the pretrial folks who can't afford the bail to get out, even when it's very low. We have a lot of people who sit in jail for weeks with a bond of $100. They can't even make that. So that becomes dangerous for those individuals. It's punitive before they are convicted, and it's dangerous for the individuals who are trying to work in there. The courts become overcrowded if we bring too many people in. So sometimes when you develop a policy like a suppression policy, and they're not necessarily bad, there's a lot of data to suggest that targeted policing and suppression policies do in fact work. What you have to do is you have to come up with another policy to alleviate the pressure that you've created in the system. So for example, now the Louisville Police Department is engaging in, I mean, because they are doing targeted policing and they are arresting more people, although correctly the self-initiated actions are seriously down, and they're down again in 2017. But what they're doing is they're working on trying to divert low-level offenders to mental health, homeless, social support facilities that they otherwise would have taken to jail, so that they can alleviate some of the overcrowding that's caused by more active policing in some of these areas. I think another issue to mention is that we need to be careful in developing criminal justice policy that we're thinking about empirical evidence. I mean, I'm a social scientist, so I'm a little biased with respect to this, but these are issues that are very value laden, and you know, it hurts us. I mean, one homicide is too many. The families of homicide victims suffer tremendously. But when we're thinking about putting together policies to solve or to ameliorate some kind of problem, we need to look for empirical evidence, and we need to look for best practices so that we have the data to support what we're doing, and not just our speculation or not just, you know, our heartfelt intuition that this is going to work. And last but not least, I think another issue within criminal justice policy development is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, every community is a little bit different, so the policies are going to have to be adjusted. But there's a whole wealth of, you guys were discussing this before we started, there's a whole wealth of literature out there. Criminologists and criminal justice researchers have been studying strategies and tactics and criminal justice policies for 40 years. And there's a lot of data that's been amassed that can talk about things that don't work specifically. We're better at finding out what doesn't work than really what works, because we don't know whether something works if it's successful for 6 months or a year or 10 years. But I mean, there's a lot of data to suggest what doesn't work. And so if we can avoid reinventing the wheel and we can avoid some of the pitfalls, then we can put together more comprehensive criminal justice policy. Now, and I'll give a pitch to the Louisville Metro Criminal Justice Commission. We have a criminal justice planning entity in Louisville. It was the first one of its kind in the United States. It's been in existence for about 40 or 50 years now. They bring together stakeholders from the public sector and the private sector who all have a vested interest in criminal justice policy. They keep each other informed. They go after major grants jointly. They work cooperatively, and I think it makes the policy development in our community stronger policy because we're able to meet those goals.
Well, thank you.
All right, Steve, can he give the website real quick?
Sure.
'Cause he didn't.
Oh, sorry. It's Pegasus, Kentucky spelled out .org/blog. The study is available there.
So I'm going to ask maybe one question, and then I'll open it up for the audience to ask questions. I think gang issues are important, and empirical data is really hard to come by. And I know the Pegasus Institute had a report, and the report indicated that they thought that 80% of the homicides in 2016 were gang-related, and the police force said, well, no, it wasn't that. But yet, they didn't bring any evidence to bear that says it wasn't that, except they just said it wasn't. So I'm wondering how you got that number, then also why we don't have good data on this. And all of you can chime in on this.
Yeah, so I should probably respond to that first, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was a number that we sourced within LMPD. We had verified by a number of individuals within LMPD. It is interpretations of data because LMPD does not track internally gang involvement in homicides. It's a number that I'm confident in, that there has never been another number given out that contradicts that number. And I'm a little bit emboldened in that in 2011, the FBI's National Gang Threat Assessment for the first time looked at this and found that there were about 1.4 million gang members in the United States in 2011. That represents about 0.5% of the overall population of the United States. Despite being a very small part of the overall population of the United States, they were responsible for the majority of violence in most jurisdiction gang members. And so the fact that Louisville has a gang problem is not something that is a disputed issue anymore. And I'm confident in that number, both here in Louisville and the FBI's numbers related to the national problem.
I can jump in now.
Sure.
So I like to kind of paint two different pictures real quick. So in the late winter of 2013, I'm talking around January, February, well, middle January into February of 2013, a former reporter for our CBS affiliate, Dwayne Pullman, he was an investigative reporter, called me and asked me if I could help him with a project. And he said it was going to be a tall order and he didn't know if we could get it done or not. But he'd like to see if there was a chance if we could engage some individuals who could be at a prison in the state of Kentucky where he could get somebody on camera to talk about the whole idea of taking a life on the streets of Louisville, somebody that has been convicted of murder, where they went through a jury trial or they went through a situation where it got pleaded out. So I told him it was a tall order. I contacted some individuals within the Kentucky Department of Corrections that I built relationships with, and one person wanted to help in the best way that they could help. And the first thing they did was they got me a list of 50 individuals from the city of Louisville who had been convicted of murder, and they committed murders either as teenagers or very young adults, 20, 21, 22 years old. And so when he gave me that list, he said, You let me know what the next step would be. So I picked, by just picking people off the list, 10 individuals. I told him to get back with the Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange and asked them, could I come up there and talk to 10 individuals who had took the life of an individual on the streets of Louisville or committed double homicides or triple homicides. And so they got the 10 together. They said I could come in to the reformatory and talk to these individuals to see if they want to be a part of what we were doing with the storyline. So I went in there and I said, if we get lucky, we'll have one person who might do this. And that was the only hope, that you would get one. Because usually, I have to put emphasis on this, usually in Metro Louisville, we don't ever have a person who's taken somebody's life or has even wounded somebody in a shooting ever get on camera and talk to media. It's just not, this is not California, it's not other places where gangs openly do that. This is a whole different nature here. And that's a longer conversation, but to get to the beef of what I'm trying to describe. So when I walked in the room with these 10 individuals, I recognized one, but none of the other ones. And I asked them and I told them about what we were trying to do and who would be willing to talk back to the so-called streets from prison about taking somebody else's life. And to my total surprise, 7 individuals raised their hands and said they want to be a part of this piece. One thing that was redundant in the conversation was about how they represented neighborhood sets and gangs. And that was a part of what put them in prison as it related to ongoing disputes and everything else. And then one caveat to that, it was a powerful piece, and you all can still go online and get this at WLKY.com. And it talks about the 7 individuals who committed murders on the streets of Louisville. It kind of hits on, in a way, the core of what Josh was talking about. That at the end of the day, most of the shootings are connected to people who want to be a part of a shooting culture. And I'll end on this note. One person who was hit by a stray bullet in March of 2015, 13 years of age, middle school student. His name is Deontay. He was coming home from an outing of the Boys and Girls Club. Some kids got into an argument, led to a fight. Somebody banished a weapon. All of them started running. The person shot in the crowd. He and another boy get shot. He was in ICU. That's where his mother called me from, up at University of Louisville Hospital. He had a collapsed lung. We didn't think he was going to make it, but he did better than that. He survived it, and from his bed, when others were trying to encourage him to go out and retaliate for that shooting, he told all of them that I got 2 brothers that are in gangs. I'm not going to fall into this trap. And I'm going to show everybody when I leave this hospital bed that I'm going to be a voice against this kind of stuff. Now that kid is at Ballard High School. He's a junior, A and B student. But here's what we wanted to let you all know, and Josh and I talked about this before this started. That this past Sunday, or early Sunday morning, a little bit after 1 a.m., Deontay texted me and said, Chris, they came and shot up the house again because of my brothers. The second time since this child got released from the hospital that their house has been riddled with bullets. And he says, I'm just tired. He says, I'm trying to graduate from high school. He says, is there any kind of way that you could try to figure out a way for me just to get away from this? Because I have nothing to do with these issues, and all I want to do is keep my grades up and graduate and go to college. And so we're trying to put some things in place to hopefully further his plight towards a prominent education. But at the same time, we just want to paint a picture to you all how some are just trapped in these issues and have nothing to do with gang violence, but they're just trapped and sucked into this this vacuum because of his 2 brothers who want to stay actively engaged in gangs in the neighborhood.
Deborah?
Want me to throw in my 2 cents worth?
If you want.
We talked about this before we started the presentation. You know, sometimes when you do public policy research or any type of research using public data, you have to get information where you can, because there are a lot of information voids. So what Josh did is he did what we would call in criminal justice, he did qualitative research. He interviewed police officers and got their opinion of, you know, whether or not homicides were gang related. So the police department keeps data, but when criminal justice agencies keep data, they keep it not for the purposes of research, they keep it for case management. And there's no reason why in the management of that case, they would need to determine whether or not it's gang related. And gang related can mean a lot of different things. The wicked problems issue that I told you about early, okay? So, you know, is it gang related if a gang member shoots his wife and kills her as part of a domestic? You know, he happened to be a gang member, he killed his wife, but is it really gang related? If you have 2 gang members who shoot each other because they're fighting over a woman, is that gang related, or was it just violence between 2 gang members? So, you know, we have these definitions, and I think that was the police department's position, was that we don't really keep track of motive, and gang related is motive driven, and you really can't determine that until you actually look at the content of the case file.
Okay, so we're going to open this up for questions. We've got microphones here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask. Please keep them short. Come on up.
Like none of us can be up here.
Okay, I had a quick question. I think there was some reference to current legislation. I think it was specifically House Bill 169, which has language that both broadens the definition of a gang and increases penalties for gang involvement. So I don't know about the knowledge that any of you have in reference to that legislation, but if you could speak on it or any related legislation, I would like to hear your thoughts.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I was called into the conversation about gang enhancements a little over a year ago. And I'm glad that you made the point about net widening, because what we did with the gang bill, in my opinion, is the exact opposite. We took a bill that had an estimated economic impact of about $40 million a year, and we have narrowed it to about $19 million over 10 years. We completely exempt non-youthful offender juveniles from the statute completely. We also only affect youthful offender individuals if they've either committed a violent offense or they have a prior felony conviction. And so all of that is to try to narrow the scope of the bill to address the worst of the worst offenders who are recruiting juveniles into gangs, who are committing acts of gang violence, and who are participating in trafficking schemes undertaken by the gang. And so the broadening, if you will, of the definition, what that does is it puts Kentucky in line with the Federal Department of Justice guidelines for what constitute a gang and a criminal gang syndicate. Those were developed under President Obama, Attorney General Holder, as a result of the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And so what it does is it changes our definitions, which were put in place in the 1930s and really reflect Prohibition-era gangs, and updates it to what gangs look like in the 21st century. But that's essentially what that bill does. There was a bill last year that was a very broad bill that applied to a lot of people, and we have been very diligent in trying to narrow that so that it only affects the worst offenders.
I'd like to jump in on that real quick. So also look at it from kind of this angle. If everybody could just paint this picture in their mind, I'll give them a real life situation. So I don't know if you all heard about Jason Spencer's unfortunate death in the Highlands. And let me explain it to you all again. He had just came off his honeymoon with his wife, newly married couple, in around Cherokee Circle. And they were coming out of a dwelling, and they were approached by 2 juveniles with 2 other juveniles in the car waiting. Now, when I describe these juveniles, 1 13-year-old and 1 14-year-old and 2 15-year-olds. And unfortunately, they described their participation in his death as wanting to go out, and street lingo is getting a lick, meaning that we want to go out and target people in other neighborhoods to exert the power of a handgun on them, whether it be through the means of wanting money or just to want to just have the satisfaction of showing others that I'm a shooter. So for you all don't totally understand this gang talk, this stuff starts getting breeded into young ones, unfortunately, at the ages of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And usually, right now, there is a widespread consensus that if you don't do early intervention and catch them when you see these behavioral issues by age 12, the shooter's already developed at 12, 13 years old. Now, that might not be real in some individuals' worlds in here, but where this problem is redundant, it's a real issue right now. And with the saturation of weapons, it's not that hard for a 12, 13-year-old to get a weapon, legal or illegal, by some kind of means, to exert that power on another human being.
Any other questions? Okay.
Just a quick comment on the gang. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that we're going to have to figure out why, as we start suppressing gangs and bringing more people into the system, how we're going to make room for them in the jail, because we have a real serious
Bail reform
issue in the jail. And bail reform would be great. We just need to get the judges convinced that that's what we should be doing.
Agreed.
Nicole?
Yes. Hi. Thank you guys so much for being here. And just building on the previous question, because that was a core aspect of what I wanted to ask about. But I know that the mayor has also issued a crime plan as of last summer. And so I don't know too much detail about that. And I don't know if that is something super policy related or more of a proclamation. But if you could speak to the status on that plan and even your analysis on it, that would be much appreciated.
You want to jump in
Is
first?
that cure violence?
Yes. Well, that's a big part of it.
Oh,
yeah.
part of it,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, you know, here's what I know. Number one, that you probably want to know that our Louisville Police Department was one of 15 police departments asked to participate in this 21st century policing initiative, and they're a model. They're going to be a model agency, and they've been engaging in a lot of activities under this plan, which is where the gang legislation comes from. And so they're then going to be best practices and for other agencies to adopt coming out of that. So that's sort of part of the plan. The other part that I know about is this cure violence, where you basically, and it's interesting because I thought years ago the CDC declared violence to be a public health issue. But anyway, we've evidently redeclared it again, as frequently happens in criminal justice. So we've redeclared it. And so it's essentially a model that's multifaceted with lots of partnerships where you address prevention and interdiction, but you look at the symptoms and then you try to cure the disease. The public health model is what they're going to use. I don't think it's very far. There's a not-for-profit that is sort of sponsoring this, and
I think they're still very much in the fundraising
the
part
police,
of that right now.
It's been successful in other cities, but it costs money.
And Doc, it's a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah,
because I want you all to think of this. You talked about the gangs, but what about all the other things that you all might have heard of where you have these personal issues of Facebook issues and other social media issues where, you know, example, somebody loses their life, somebody gets wounded, somebody says something on Facebook, and this person might not even be in a gang or a so-called neighborhood clique, but just has access to a weapon and feels the way that I'm gonna deal with this anger is that I have the power of the handgun and I'll go settle this difference in that particular way. So we have a lot of shootings in Louisville are not necessarily gang related. It's that people have access to weapons now, and then when they snap, they go snap. And you have sometimes first offenders who are caught up in shootings where you would have never thought that they would have been bought into this issue, but that's the kind of culture that's kind of evolved.
Yeah, I think as it relates to that, Chris, you bring up a very important point that violence both within the gang subcontext and outside of it revolves around what is often referred to as the 3 R's, which is respect, reputation, and retaliation. That anytime one of those is at play, a violent instance can emerge. One of the reasons that I find myself talking about suppression efforts and police and prosecutors and the role that the criminal justice system plays is because the conversation nationally has become very prevention oriented, which I think is a critical part of it, but it's also only a part. And so I think the gang bill, focus deterrence policing, coupled with efforts like cure violence and prevention efforts, is the exact kind of thing that cities like Cincinnati did, like Boston did with Operation Ceasefire, which is sort of another one of these gold standard programs. And so when we do these things in a collaborative and a meaningful way, I think you can see real change.
I want to also thank you for your contributions to criminal justice. I was appalled to learn that for offenders to expunge their records, they had to pay over $500 to do that, which I would imagine is an insurmountable amount for some people. My question is, what entity in Kentucky set that amount? Where does the money go? And is there any chance of that being lowered?
And if you want to answer that, explain to him who can get their record expunged and who can't.
Is it a court fee?
Yeah.
Is it a court fee?
I believe so, yeah. So the legislature is who puts that dollar value in place. That dollar value is designed to cover the costs associated with administering the expungement, the court costs affiliated with it. There are a number of individual donors here in Louisville and nonprofits who have stepped forward to pay for those for individuals. There are some states who have either done away with or significantly reduced their filing fees for expungement, and so I think it's possible. I know there was an expungement bill that was filed this session. I don't think it addressed the fees. I think it just expanded the offenses that you could have expunged, but to my understanding that bill has not moved at all. But there's no reason that the legislature couldn't amend or eliminate that dollar value, and there are some nonprofits and wealthy individuals who have stepped forward to pay those fees at certain events. The Louisville Urban League just did a very large event related to expungement. The Public Defender's Office, or the Public Advocate's Office, and the ACLU have done events to do that kind of stuff, and so I hope you'll see those kinds of efforts continue.
We've got time for one more question. Okay.
So you all were talking of expungement, but to get to expungement, we actually have to get people out of our prisons in Kentucky, which has been a large issue for us. If you don't know, we have some of the longest terms that people serve in our prisons. If you all could address that, what steps should we be taking towards rehabilitation insides and outsides of prisons and to shortening those sentences to address crime?
Let me jump in real quick. So I quickly learned from some individuals that I built relationships with let me say this, at the state cabinet level, about how many people, excuse me, rotate out of the Kentucky prison system. And it's 22, they have at max sometimes 24,000 inmates.
Yep.
22,000 will hit the streets. 2,000 will kind of stay in there permanently. And so it's a big challenge to try to reintroduce them into society and to at least try to navigate their minds in another direction where they won't be repeat offenders. So it's a tremendous challenge, but believe you me, there are individuals coming out of the prison system all the time.
And what we need to do is we need to change the way we view incarceration, all right? So historically, we have talked about using alternatives to incarceration. So that means that we think first, put them in jail or prison, and then after that, let's look for some reasons why we might put them on probation, home incarceration, work release, whatever. We need to flip that. I mean, jail needs to be viewed as the alternative after the individual has not been able to go to any of the community-based services or entities that are out there, because, as we all know, the further you remove them from their ties with the community, the more difficult the rehabilitation becomes. And so we want to keep them closer to the community. Secondly, we need to decide who we want to do time in prison and who we want to do time in jail, and we need to prioritize it. So we need to, if we think more about using options other than jail and prison, then these low-level drug offenders, low-level property offenders are not going to be put into the prisons and the jails, and so we can keep them out, we can solve overcrowding. The problem is that we as a society, I probably shouldn't say this, my personal opinion here, there's no data to this effect, but we as a society are very vested in punishment. I mean, we've never really truly supported rehabilitation historically, but until we start viewing incarceration as the last option, put them through these other options first, it's going to be a challenge.
There are three things I'll say very quickly. One, it's important when looking at those numbers to break it down a little bit further. Our mean time incarcerated is relatively high. That is disproportionately swayed by the number of serve-out orders that are given at first-term parole eligibility. But about 46% of 20% parole-eligible inmates in Kentucky are paroled at their 20% eligibility. We also have a lot of serve-outs. And so we really have a reverse bell curve in terms of the time that people stay in. That's a problem for a number of reasons, but it is a little bit more complex that way. The second thing I'll say is that we have a huge problem with pretrial release in Kentucky. In 2016, we had 15,000 cases where individuals had a bond, a monetary bond of $1,000 or less, who could not afford that monetary bond, and so they sat until their plea agreement or their trial in a county facility. We had 44,000 non-sexual, non-violent, low and moderate risk individuals who simply could not afford their monetary bond. At the exact same time, we had almost 1,000 violent and sexual offenders who were assessed a monetary bond, paid it, and got out. Having money at the center of your bail system will give you reverse results like that all the time, upside down results. The final thing I'll say is we need a legitimate alternative to incarceration. I agree that incarceration should be reserved for people that we are afraid of, not people we are mad at, but you need to give prosecutors and judges a system that they can have faith in to release those people into. Other states have done it. Hawaii did it with HOPE. South Dakota does it with 24/7 sobriety. Washington State is the first state that has put together a comprehensive community supervision program that includes random drug tests, regular check-ins with probation and parole, peer-to-peer mentoring like AA and NA, and they were able to move 16,000 inmates from jails and prisons into this community supervision program, but it costs upfront money. Criminal justice reform can never be about dollars spent, because if we're going to do it right, it's almost always going to cost money up front.
But putting in then the alternatives to incarceration cost you $2
right.
a day.
Will save you money over the long term, big time, but it costs upfront dollars.
Want to end on one note, but believe you me.
There's pizza.
Yeah, believe you me, there's a lot of programs out here, but unless you have the willing who should be participating in these programs, unfortunately, it's just like substance abuse. If you don't want to get off of the drugs, you're going to keep abusing. If you don't want to not be a shooter, just going to keep being an addictive shooter. Simple as that. Okay, so your students who are in RSOs, this is a project you could do is raise money for scholarships for people like Deontay. This would be a great thing for RSOs to do. But I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to thank our panel. It was a great panel. Pizza in the back. Have a good. Steve, appreciate it.